I'm the director of the Laudato Si Research Institute, and our first session is on the issues of governance. I'm going to hand over now to our chair for the session, who will be introducing the speakers, Dr. Sarah Darby, who is Associate Professor with the Energy Programme at the Environmental Change Institute, which is part of the University of Oxford. So over to you, Sarah, and thank you so much for your help.
Thank you, Celia. And welcome everyone to this afternoon's session. So we're now coming towards the close of the conference, and it's very good to, it seems extremely timely point at which to have a session on governance and the difficult business of making the sort of world we long for happen with all the different people and interests involved in that. So I'm delighted we've got with us to speak about this Anna, Lara, and Professor Molly Scott Cato. And Anna is a policy officer at the European Commission's Directorate General for Climate Action. So absolutely in the thick of things when it comes to European decision-making on climate. And she has previous experience in several of the Commission's departments, including the Directorates General for Economic and Financial Affairs, for Taxation, for Customs Union, and working for the Secretary General. Anna's also been a researcher covering labour economics, migration, regional economics, and applied econometrics. So a lot of policy and governance experience there. I'll introduce our speakers as we go along, but first of all, delighted to hand over to you, Anna, to speak to us on your topic of Fit for 55, which is one that's new to me, stepping up the efforts to decarbonise the EU, so about the raising of ambition in the European Union. Over to you, Anna.
Yeah. Thank you, Sarah, for this kind introduction, and thank the organizers for the opportunity to kind of acquaint you with our efforts, stepping up efforts to decarbonize the EU. Let me try to bring my slides on the screen. We did a test, but let me see if it works. Just a second. Where is it? Share screen, right? So I'm sharing screen now. This is the screen to be shared, and I put it on slideshow. So I guess that you are seeing now my introduction slide. I have to apologize. It should be decarbonize the EU and not the EUC. Supposed to be the Commission. We also have a plan to decarbonize the European Commission, but the two things are not the same, evidently. Actually, as Sarah had referred to, I have been working in various places across the Commission in the past decade, and so I've been moving around a bit. And if I am in touch these days with former colleagues, you know, and then we have a chat like, "What are you doing?" and so on, and I say like I'm working on the Fit for 55, then more often I got the response, I didn't do that. I didn't know that we have a pre-retirement program you are working on now. I thought like you were moving to DG Klima. This has been a response I've coming across quite frequently, and you might also have the impression that I'm going to talk now about something preparing people for retirement. Actually, we are working on pre-retirement, but it's not pre-retirement of people; it's pre-retirement of burning fossil fuels, because Fit for 55 is our legislative package we are working upon right these days to prepare Europe for 2030 to be able to reach greenhouse gas neutrality in 2050. So this is what I would like to take you through. The starting point for our efforts is the global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius report of the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change on climate change that makes clear that to contain serious risks to our ways of living our societies, and then it is really, we would be really very well advised to go for the 1.5%. maximum global warming, and we are already well in pace to reach global warming beyond that, as you are all aware. And the report also projects that very likely this 1.5% could be already reached in a relatively near term between 2030 and 50. Something like a central point in time would be 2040. So this is all very clear that we need to take action now, and this is basically the scientific background on which the Commission body of work rests. So this report had been issued 2018, but now really movement into the things came. I have to go to the next slide, just a second. Yes, we got movement into the issue. What is this? No notes. Yes. This is the slide presenting the so-called, or summarizing, capturing the so-called European Green Deal, which is basically the political program of the present Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, who took this job up in late 2019, European Green Deal. This had been her commitments also ahead of her stepping up as European Commission President. It is kind of a mighty, yes?
Anna,
yes?
I'm sorry to interrupt, but could you move down one slide, please?
Down?
Yes. Just press the down arrow, I think. Then
you don't mean this? What do you...
we're seeing a blank slide at the moment.
You are still seeing the blank. What do you see now?
Still the blank.
This is not good. Very strange, because I'm ahead. Okay, just a second. Okay, do you see what you should?
Yes, we do.
Very strange, apologies, because I have various screens and all the screens are in different places in my presentation for unknown reasons. So European Green Deal is basically our green agenda, if you wish. And part of this green agenda is to increase the EU's climate ambition for 2030 and 2050. So the Commission President committed to take action for 2030. Just to tell it already now, we have presently a target for 2030 that we consider medium-term target at 40% relative to 1990. The Commission President said at that point that she is ready to make proposals to increase the target to 50% or 55% in a responsible way. Actually, 2019, when the Commission changed, was quite, let's say, dynamic year from the point of view of climate action. You will surely remember that basically Greta Thunberg was everywhere, and we saw protests of Fridays for Future. This was basically the last year before the Corona crisis. So a lot of things were happening, and 55% seemed quite a step forward in the eyes of some, lesser so in the eyes of others, but we were there at that moment. And this will be part of the European Green Deal. So this is how, under the present Commission, we started off in November 2019. Now I'm going to the next slide. Hopefully I'm doing the right thing. Actually, this work didn't start in 2019. This work started before, based on the 1.5% degree report of the IPCC, because in fact the Paris Agreement had invited parties to adopt their midterm low decarbonization strategies already by 2020, and the Commission had been preparing for that. 1 year before 2019 and 2019, namely in end 2018, the Commission came forward with the so-called Clean Planet for All communication, where this was a broad analytical piece studying the possibilities and different scenarios and different pathways actually to reach climate neutrality by the mid-century, by 2050, and basically put forward this possibility to the co-legislators, which are the European Parliament and the Council. And this proposal of getting net zero by 2050 got endorsed by the European Parliament and the European Council, and it was also submitted to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change at the end of 2020. Now, just to explain net zero. So we have now the long-term climate objective of getting net zero by 2050. This is, of course, not a plain zero. Just to make it clear, first of all, it refers to all greenhouse gases. So it's climate neutrality, not carbon neutrality. And the second thing is it's net zero, which means that it is projected that some emissions will be there. These are the heavy to abate emissions, but they will be compensated by sinks, carbon sinks, and also carbon capture, so that at the end we end up at net zero. So this is the idea. Now, in April this year, the co-legislators have reached agreement to have this objective enshrined in the so-called climate law, European climate law, making it really legislation. Basically, this piece of law is on track now. Now all the technicalities are being worked out, and at some point it will be published in the official journal, and then we have really the climate neutrality objective in legislation in Europe. I don't know, is it, I hope I'm not speaking too fast, because this is a general risk I'm tending to have. I hope you can follow so far. with this 2050, during the process of negotiation, the discourse started to focus also on the near-term target, which is 2030. And based on the preparatory work that I'm going to explain to you, the proposal was made actually to really take as a 2030 climate target relative to 1990, a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by at least 55%. This was what Ursula von der Leyen claimed to propose in a responsible fashion. I will come to what responsible means, but in fact, the background work has been done, and the climate law before kind of final agreement has been amended based on a proposal by the Commission, also to include the 55% objective for 2030. So this is the 55 that I'm speaking about, and already it's also going to be part of the climate law. What is the responsible qualifier in this context? It means that, of course, we cannot make just a proposal proposing any figure that might sound appropriate relative to the challenge, however, not consider the economic and social effects, and not consider that we really have to have basically people on board. The Commission President has said it very often, and also our Vice President Timmermans, who is in charge of the climate policy, that we need to have everyone, we may not leave everyone behind, because either we have an inclusive climate policy or we are not getting far with it because people are not going to accept. I have to say at this point, I will come back to that. Many of you will remember the moment of Gilets jaunes 2 years ago. This left quite an impression on policymakers, and everyone is aware that anything is being proposed needs to be done in a responsible way. So I'm moving to my next slide. The climate target plan. The climate target plan is basically, again, a big piece of analytical work, impact assessment, considering how we can reach the 55%. So it's a lot of analytical work behind, and it makes the point that it's possible to set Europe on a smoother path. So we need to have 55 in 2030, because we cannot just postpone the action for the later decades in these 30 years. And it's possible to do that without heavily detrimental impacts on our economies and societies. And we need to do that. This plan rests on a lot of evidence. It's covering the EU as a whole. It's covering all sectors of the economy, and it's also envisaging domestic reductions and net reductions, as I said. So again, with this background, already at the end of last year, the EU was in a position to formulate this medium-term target of 55% and submit it again to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change as the EU's nationally determined contribution for 2030. So this is basically the kind of long-term objective of net zero in 2050 and the immediate target for 2030 that had been stepped up from the 40% that we had so far to 55%. For the time being. So how are we going to achieve this? The EU is having, so basically, if you have to reach somewhere an aggregate figure of emissions that can come from very multiple sources, of course, you need a kind of a battery of legislation to make sure that the economies are moving into the right direction. The EU does have this legislation already well in force under the so-called Energy Union. And the most important kind of measures there are the reductions relative to 1990 of overall greenhouse gases. We used to have for 2020 20%. Now at present we are having at least 40%, but more is to come, as said. But also there are other sectoral targets. We have targets for the share of renewable energy in the energy consumption. We have targets for the for energy efficiency and also for interconnections, because this matters on how much renewable energy the European energy system is meant to absorb. So you can very well see here that basically climate policy has very much a lot to do with energy policy, and this is all, these pieces all work together basically to deliver the attainment of our targets. So now these legislations exist already, and now we are presently, these days as I speak, we are intensely working on the, what happens now? My PowerPoint is showing not responding. Am I still having the slide there? Hello?
No, we're not seeing anything now.
Neither me, I have to say. Yeah, now I'm back. Okay, good.
Excuse
me,
yes.
there was a moment of instability. So actually, we are these days intensely working. As you see, our network is also kind of being heavily used, our computer network, on the 50 to 55 package, which basically means amending those pieces of legislation that are already there to kind of step up the ambition in those pieces, but also complement that with other pieces. So basically broaden the package and make it more kind of stringent, more intensified. I will come to the key parts of this in a nutshell, but just to highlight it now, you will see it is the package covers the three most important pieces. Most important pieces. It's here. The emissions trading system, the effort sharing regulation. I will explain that in a minute. And the so-called LULUCF regulation, land use change, and forestry. So these are the main pieces covering the main sectors where emissions come from. And then there are, of course, the sectoral targets, energy efficiency and renewables. These have to also contribute to the targets. We are then having CO2 standards on cars and vans, which is going to be adjusted also, so stepped up basically. And now we are going to see two new pieces of legislation that we didn't have, or no, one is there already. The energy taxation directive is already there. There will be a proposal to kind of also align it with the present requirements, but I have to say on energy taxation, this is a difficult area because taxation requires anonymity in the council, and taxation on the European level is normally not very successful, let's put it this way. On the other hand, there will be also the proposition of a so-called carbon border adjustment mechanism. This will be something entirely new that is meant to make sure that the carbon leakage argument cannot be kind of exploited by industries to have free allowances, free possibilities to emit, because basically we are no longer allowing imports of carbon intensive goods just like without having a price on them. Yeah, I don't know who of you followed the news. I was surprised this morning to see that quite a lot of detail on this proposal is already available in the public sphere. I don't know where it came from. But it's being heavily discussed. Good. So this is what we are going to have in our Fit for 55 package that is going to be launched. Basically, what is it now? In one month and a half, 6 weeks. 6 weeks time. So now let me take a little bit of a look on the most important parts. I'm not going to bore you with many details of this legislation, but just to explain, the main instrument we have to get decarbonized is the European emissions trading system. This system has been introduced 2005, at that point together with the UK, obviously. The UK actually had a pilot scheme indeed before. And it's the so-called crown jewel of the European climate policy. Many people and many associations were very hesitant to kind of find sympathy with the ETS because it's basically auctioning rights to emit greenhouse gases. But in fact, the European emission trading system has heavily delivered. In the over 15 years of its existence, the emissions covered by the scheme have been declined by about 35%. And there were times where the price, so I don't know if it's clear or not, but the system works that so this is so-called a cap and trade system. So there is a certain amount of allowances that are provided to the covered industries to allow them emitting greenhouse gases. So these industries need to buy these allowances, they are auctioned. And the cap is going to decrease over time to make sure that the sectors don't emit more than is allowed. So basically, this is the decarbonization decarbonization path set by the cap, and they are auctioned. That means that the firms who are ready to pay the highest price for the emissions are going to buy them. So it's a market-based scheme, and this is not liked by many, but in fact, the result is that it has delivered. And not only that, it delivered as much that now the proposals will include also the consideration to broaden this system also to include the sectors of buildings and road transport, because these sectors have been found so far hard to decarbonize, but of course we have to get every sector on board. These sectors have a little bit of specificity, which are also that the activities are much more directly felt by the consumers. So this is a little bit of a challenge, because also certain member states are not very keen on having this extension of the emissions trading system, because they are fearing that their societies have a large number of people who cannot afford having a price increase in the price of petrol, in the price of diesel, or in the price of heat fuel, for example. But as said, a very important dimension of the Commission's approach is to leave no one behind, and therefore the Commission is taking these concerns very seriously, and reflecting on these concerns will be certainly taken up in the proposal. So basically, this is when it comes to the effort, to the emissions trading system. The next big part, so we can divide. Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but could I ask you, perhaps you may need to, I think you may need to skip some of your material in order to allow time for everyone.
Yeah, indeed, I see the point. So let me basically, well, in a nutshell, explain what's going on in the other parts. The other parts, so what is not under this market, this is under the control of member states. And there we have a very simple approach. We need to share efforts. Efforts have to be carried by everyone. And there are two principles. The one is fairness. The richer member states should do more. The other is cost efficiency. And unfortunately, the two don't work in the same direction because the poorer member states have more cheap opportunities to decarbonize. So that would put basically a higher burden on them. The trick is to find the balance between the two so that it's acceptable to two, how to share the higher effort to reach the 55%. So this is the second part of the story. Now comes the third part in a nutshell. Really in a nutshell, this is the land use and forestry sector. So far, this sector was only required to keep in balance. So that means that you cannot harvest more from your forests than you make sure that your sinks are being maintained. There is a sophisticated accounting system behind it. This system is going to be strengthened, and the sector as such is going to have a dedicated target to build up a kind of positive sink, so basically to swallow emissions. This is what we have there. I want to say two more things and then I'm done. The one is that all these activities will require, of course, a lot of investment, a lot of action to shift transit to a different mode of economic activity. And this, of course, requires a lot of money. And this is not to the liking of many, obviously. But there, luckily, we are in the situation that a lot of money has been mobilized to kind of relaunch economies after the COVID crisis. And the most important from the Europe point of view is the so-called recovery fund. And member states are presently in the final phases of getting they have been setting up plans, how to kind of, what sort of economic policy action to take to get their countries out of the aftermath of the COVID crisis. And for getting this money, we are working with the member states on their plans, and it's a large amount. We are talking about 670 billion of euro over 5 to 6 years. And the point here is that 37% is supposed to go on climate action, which is quite an important share. And then we have something new, which is now kind of dissipating into all sectors where we work together with member states on spending programs. This is a so-called do no significant harm principle. That means that all measures that countries are taking, no matter if they fall under the 37% or not, they are being very thoroughly checked on their environmental effects, including also their impacts on climate mitigation and adaptation. When I talk about money, I also want to acquaint you with the just transition mechanism. This is the idea that there are certain regions, you are shown them on the map here, that are heavily dependent on fossil fuel extraction or kind of carbon intensive industries, and they need special support and special plans also to get out of that. So we are really kind of providing help to these targeted regions to make the transition easier for them and lead them into a different way of living. Basically, this was it. So now I presented you the legislative framework and also the 55%. This is what we have now. This is how to want to reach it. Of course, all this package is going to be put forward. It then needs to be adopted by the co-legislators. Some people say 55% is a lot. Some people say it's not enough. Whether it's enough or not enough depends on a final piece in the overall puzzle, and this is of course the people, because my impression is, or my conclusion from what I saw in the past years, is that the 55% would not have been possible as such without all this action that happened in 2019. And in fact, the Commission's work also has a dimension really to activate this potential of people's readiness to do more for climate. And in this sense, we have launched at the end of last year the so-called European Climate Pact, which considers a number of ways really to work together with people, or that people work together as so-called climate ambassadors, for example, really at their level in their lives to kind of make our societies ready to embark on this important journey to the 55 or even beyond. So this was what I wanted to present you on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Anna, and that look at the picture it gives us of the huge task facing the European Commission and the huge scale on which you have to work. Scaling up has been an issue that's come up in this conference, and it is something perhaps that some of you who are taking part this afternoon may want to ask questions about. I should have, of course, have encouraged you at the beginning to use the Q&A box to raise some questions that we can ask our speakers at the end. So thank you again very much. And we'll move on now to our next speaker, who is Molly Scott Cato, who has been a Green member of been part of the body of the European Commission. And Molly is also Professor of Green Economics in the Business School at Roehampton University. And her work addresses the question of how we might design and organise an economy that can fit within planetary limits and achieve social justice at the same time. So if you like, a donut. And she's particularly interested in the link between the growth imperative that drives our environmental crisis and the debt-based nature of the money system that we have. So this is picking up on a theme that came up Wednesday afternoon. So Molly, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you, Anna, for that. You've made me feel quite nostalgic about my days of being in Brussels. And some of the jargon I recognised and some jargon has come along since I left. And it was also useful, actually, that you finished up with the issue of people and the role people have to play, because that's one of the sort of themes that runs through what I'm going to be talking about. Sarah, before I start sharing my slides, could I just ask you to shout at sort of 3 minutes before my time's up, and then I'll skip to my conclusions. It's quite difficult
I'll do that, yes.
Yeah, it's quite difficult to know how much you actually have time for when you're presenting. So hope this is going to work. Can people see the slides? Sarah, is it working?
Yes, coming through well. Yeah.
Perfect. Perfect. Thank you. So this is what I've decided to speak about. Again, I'm focusing on climate, but I'm focusing on climate from a slightly different point of view, and I would say really from a feminist point of view. And yeah, I'm really looking at the issue of when we say people have to deal with climate change and people are suffering from climate change, is there a gender dimension there? And you won't be surprised to hear that I think there very much is. So when I started putting this together, the split between Bill and Melinda Gates was announced, and I thought that might be rather an interesting way of looking at this. And I have to say, before I get into the detail of that, that there's, you know, as a professor, I go away and I look at the literature, and I was really surprised by how little academic research there was on this topic. And I really celebrate the fact that this conference has been put together, because it gives us a chance to address the gender dimension of the ecological crisis, but also of the climate crisis. And I think we really need to make women and the role of women and the role women are playing and need to play much more visible, and to really bring the gender dimension to the fore in this discussion. There's obviously a risk of essentializing, as I'm going to fall into that trap immediately by talking about Bill and Melinda Gates. But I still think we need to find ways to have that discussion and bring the gender lens to bear on the climate crisis. Not only because I think women have a particular contribution to make, but also because women are certainly bearing the burden of subsistence and much more affected, as I'll present some evidence to this effect, by the climate crisis and the impact it's already having. So back to Bill and Melinda. The UN says that although the UNFCCC, I've got enough C's, has a specific gender stream, and women have demonstrated leadership on climate both as part of the COP process in national governments and in climate campaigns, there is still a sense that the technological and business sectors dominated by men take precedence in policy discussions around the climate crisis. And I'm sort of framing that through Bill and Melinda Gates now, because you may have seen Bill Gates as, I think he actually says how to say, I think he actually called his book How to Save the World. Could he have that much hubris? I think he did, in fact. But anyway, he's now come in with his sort of personal solutions to the climate crisis. And you won't be surprised to hear, as a tech entrepreneur, he has focused very much on the need to invest in market-based tech enterprises. Now, as somebody who's been in this game for 30 years, there were many limitations to what he was talking about, and some of them I think would be severely counterproductive. For example, you may have heard him on the Today programme arguing that it would be fine for him to continue to use his private jet. Presumably he thinks he has enough money to offset or something, you know, but to me, climate justice is very much about everybody making the same reductions, and that means changes to everybody's lifestyle, and sort of implying that there are some unicorn technological solutions somewhere there, as John Kerry did when he said, you know, most of the solutions we need to reduce climate change don't exist. Well, if they don't exist, you need to do something else, you know. But there's this sort of almost magical belief that technology will come along and solve the problem. Bill Gates' solution is really problematic in sidelining the role of nature, both as a carbon sink and relying on technology rather than working with nature, continuing to work against nature, which is actually what's caused the problem in the first place. It ignores displacement effects and fails to see the whole system, the whole ecological system. And it fails, in my view, to have a sort of spiritual humility, which I think is something that this conference would very much support. And it very much sidelines social innovation. And this is where I refer back to what Anna was saying about people. If we're going to solve climate change, people are going to solve climate change, men and women. It's not machines that are going to solve the issue. And so I think diversion from real world policies, like, for example, a carbon tax, which I think is the most powerful and important policy that should be agreed at the COP later this year, making the polluters pay and therefore making it expensive to produce carbon dioxide emissions. Unless we have real world policies like that, we're not going to address the issue. So where's Melinda on all of this? Well, if you search for Melinda Gates, she almost entirely disappears under entries about her ex-husband. But it's interesting that once they set up their foundation together, Bill Gates started changing his perspective very much. And I think we can see her influence clearly there. So it's fairly clear that she's the one that's prioritized support for the countries and peoples of the majority world. The vaccination campaign that the foundation set up under her leadership led to the eradication of polio in Africa. She's very much focused on women's empowerment, women's education, and women's access to reproductive rights. And her book, The Power of Lift, highlights the failure to acknowledge women's unpaid work, drawing on the feminist economist Marilyn Waring's book, If Women Counted. So I'm hoping I can draw some conclusions about the different approaches to the climate crisis of men and women, although, as I say, we must always beware of the risk of essentializing. And so I'm going to bring in two colleagues of mine who are both renewable energy engineers. Lorna Slater, who's the co-leader of the Scottish Green Party, and Carla Denyer, who's a Green councillor in Bristol. And so just to say, I am aware that women are also involved in green tech and men are also involved in the social solutions, but I still think it does help to bring in a gender dimension to the discussion. So the rest of what I'm going to talk about is almost entirely focused on contributions women have made, because actually women have played a really important leadership role in addressing the climate crisis, and I'd like to showcase the work of some of them. So the first one is Patricia Scotland, who was the 6th Secretary General of the Commonwealth and the first woman to hold that post. She is a British Dominican diplomat, barrister and politician, and former UK Attorney General. And as you can see here, she says women shouldering the burden of the climate crisis need action, not speeches. And I think that's kind of the first point of the argument I want to make. Women are shouldering that burden and they need to see action and support for their social work, their work in families and communities, to take the action on the ground that's actually going to resolve the climate crisis. And then we have Mary Robinson, former president of Ireland, and who set up her own foundation focused on climate justice. She says, I came to climate change from human rights work, basically. And I often say publicly, it came late to me because when I served for 5 years as UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, I never really made any important speech on climate. It was done somewhere else under the Climate Convention. And it was only after she moved to work with NGOs, and particularly her work in Africa, that she realized these were the rights that really mattered, the human rights that really mattered, were being undermined by the climate crisis. So she has now set up this Centre for Thought Leadership, Education and Advocacy on the struggle to secure global justice for those people vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, the people who are usually forgotten in the high-level, high-tech policy discussions, the poor, the disempowered and the marginalised across the world. Here's another climate heroine, Christina Figueres, who led the process that means we have the Paris Agreement. For all its flaws, it's a global agreement, which I think you can very much see her personal approach in the way that the Paris Agreement works. And I know that when I was working as an MEP, I could bring it into play every day when there was an attempt to renege on climate action. So she has written a lot about how she tried to change the tenor and culture of the negotiations and tried to move away from a sort of confrontational zero-sum game approach and into a sort of we all need to work together, we've all got something to gain approach. And I think the nationally determined contributions process has done that in a really powerful way. It's shifted the emphasis, and actually now we see countries competing to do better than each other rather than competing to limit what they have to do relative to the other player. And she says she realized the importance of changing the mood at the negotiations. There could be no victory without optimism. I decided to set a clear intention, even if we did not know precisely how, a global deal would emerge, simply because it was necessary. It was that contagious frame of mind that led to effective decision-making, despite the enormous complexities under which we were operating. And she thinks that optimism is the most important quality. I think that's very true. Hard to maintain, but very true. And as she says, as she learned during her stewardship of the Paris Agreement, if you do not control the complex landscape of a challenge, and you rarely do, the most powerful thing you can do is to change how you behave in that landscape, using yourself as a catalyst for overall change. I'm going to ask a controversial question here. Is that a view from somebody who comes from Costa Rica? Is that the view from a woman? Is it a view you would expect to hear from a British or American man? We can address that in the questions. Right, my next woman.
3 minutes. 3 minutes.
3 minutes. I knew you were going to do that. Okay, I'm just going to say, here's Linnea Engström, who I worked with. She's a Swedish MEP. She did some excellent work, not only writing a report on the climate, the gender dimension of climate action, but also introducing this idea of climate feminism and actually starting to think about what that might mean. So just to conclude, what conclusions can we draw? Sorry, I have to skip through so much stuff. Here we are. How do we redress this balance so that women have more power over climate policy? And the bits I've left out are the bits that show that women are bearing the brunt of the climate crisis already, and particularly marginalized women in the majority world. So it's very much a moral duty to address this question of how we make sure that gender dimension is recognized when we're taking action on the climate crisis. So I ask, women see this as a shared, just as Anna said, just as I'm saying, women see this as a shared and social problem that needs social solutions and social innovation. And I think we must emphasize that perspective as against what I would consider the more masculine perspective of tech, finding solutions, finance and tech, which is where a lot of the discussion does focus. Can we use this narrative of planet repairs and the need for reparations for a history of enslavement and colonialism to empower women across the world? Because I genuinely believe that without empowering women to make change, we will not solve the problem of climate change, and we will also see women suffering more as they are carrying the main burden of the consequences of the climate crisis. And so just to end on a slightly light-hearted note, you may have noticed that the UK decided that the team that was going to lead on the climate summit was going to be all men. So we were the global leaders on climate. We were the hosts of COP26, and the team, the 5 people that were leading on that were all men. This led to an outcry from people, including myself, and we now have 3 women added in. But the fact that the government, the British government, could think that's fine, we'll just have the guys doing that, I find kind of a real indication of the kind of problem we're facing. But I would say, not just to the women in the audience, but to the men as well, we shouldn't get mad about that, but we should get even. We should make sure that women have an equal role to play, because what women are bringing to the table on climate action is, I think, more important than what men are bringing. And we need to use our skills in building coalitions and creating solidarity, just as we saw with Christina Figueres, because unless we have that perspective and those skills at the table, we are not going to address this most important crisis facing humanity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Molly. And just one little comment, perhaps a note of encouragement. I do notice these days among our engineering students and some of the engineers in this university an increasing interest in shared and social issues. They are starting to get more on board, I think, with the social business of making technical solutions work. So there is at least some movement in that direction, though I certainly agree with you, not nearly enough. Now, at this point in the afternoon, we have our respondent to our two wonderful speakers, and this being going to be Cliona Sharkey, who unfortunately is unwell, but instead Dr. Erin Lothes. I hope I've pronounced your name correctly, Erin, from New Jersey, I think.
From New York.
New York, yes, from St. Elizabeth University. Erin's a senior program manager for the Laudato Si animator program, so very much in the heart of the Laudato Si program. And she's an associate professor at St. Elizabeth University and works on energy ethics and faith-based environmentalism. So she's recently written a piece on the ethics of the carbon, transitional and renewable energy economies in the light of current Catholic social teaching. And in addition to her academic work, Erin has also been very involved in interfaith activism, divestment, and so forth. So Erin, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you to Anna and Molly for your very insightful and strong presentations this morning, and to the Laudato Si Research Institute for hosting this important conversation. I'm so pleased to be welcomed to represent Cliona Sharkey, who couldn't be here today, but both of us are representing the global Catholic climate movement. And so I think we're representing these popular movements that both of you have spoken about, the power of the people to call for change, which is what we really need if we are going to make a difference and bring about all the technological and policy and societal changes that we need. So I begin with, pardon me, a quote from Pope Francis from Fratelli Tutti, where he remarks that solidarity, understood in its most profound meaning, is a way of making history. And this is what popular movements are doing. That's paragraph 116. And our popular movements are certainly calling for a change in history. So I will simply make some brief remarks focusing on Catholic social teaching and solidarity, which affirms the dignity of all people, particularly women, and is the foundation for our response to these crises. And so in doing so, I'd like to emphasize several points about relationality that, as Pope Francis says, it cannot be emphasized enough how everything is interconnected, and that our world is built on 3 levels of relationship with God, our neighbor, and the earth. And so in terms of solidarity, women, and ecology,
Erin, I think you may be muted.
there is a world without access to energy, and that the impact on women and girls is most outstanding in terms of deaths from indoor cooking. So today, Catholic social teaching, inspired by St. Francis and Pope Francis, sees a transformation in what the love of creation and love of neighbor calls us to. It calls us to a new energy ethic, which is, as I see it, a radical solidarity. In Laudato Si, Pope Francis writes that the developed countries ought to help pay their ecological debt by significantly limiting their consumption of non-renewable energy, and by assisting poorer countries to support policies and programs of sustainable development. The poorest areas in countries are less capable of adopting new models for reducing environmental impact because they lack the wherewithal to develop the necessary processes and to cover their costs. So he's calling our attention to the ecological debt and challenging the advanced nations to develop the more capital intensive energy processes and allow developing nations access to the remaining easier to access fossil fuels that are capable in our carbon budget. This same point is driven home by a fascinating text by the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace, which is called Energy, Justice, and Peace, a reflection on energy in the current context of development and environmental protection, a book that predates Laudato Si, which writes, advanced countries have the moral duty of developing the use of the most complex and capital-intensive energy technologies in order to allow poor countries to feed their development. So we see the call for solidarity in attempts to rectify the ecological debt. This text goes on to reflect on participation, development, and peace. Look how energy plays a role in justice and solidarity, influences conflict, underdevelopment, and environmental degradation, and really sees energy as a factor in development and peace. And that therefore we need to develop ethical criteria for judging our energy policies. And here I have a photograph of the Solar Sisters who develop and sell and empower other women to be entrepreneurs, sharing solar technologies that alleviate this crisis of dirty energy in the home and empower women as well as small business owners. So a project that I worked on was a collaborative exploration of energy ethical principles that, again, was done before Laudato Si, looking at principles developed by the US bishops, which emphasize that energy relates to life, to well-being of people and ecosystems, to shared rights and responsibilities, seeking the common good, that all have claims in justice upon the goods of energy, and especially on energy access for the poor and participation. And this is a key issue for women in marginalized groups. How are women in marginalized groups contributing to policy decisions about energy, to awareness of what their energy technologies, what their impact will be upon them and their families, and of course, technological prudence about technologies. And I think Molly has emphasized that point so well with her contrast of Bill and Melinda Gates. And this becomes a cornerstone of Laudato Si, with Pope Francis's emphasis on the technocratic paradigm and his critiques of that. My second point is on the radical relationality of the world, and that as a foundation for deep, deep solidarity. Laudato Si writes, in terms of biodiversity loss, because of us, thousands of species will no longer give glory to God by their very existence, nor convey their message to us. We have no such right. So in the spirit of St. Francis, who sees brother air, sister water, sister forest, brother bear, sister frog, all the creatures in whom we are in a radical relationship of solidarity, the Global Catholic Climate Movement is putting forward as one of its main advocacy projects this year, the Healthy People, Healthy Planet petition, which calls all to urgently affirm the Paris Agreement, to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, and to a new biodiversity global goal of 50% conservation of lands and waters, and to recognize the ecological debt of high-income nations, and to stop all new fossil fuel infrastructure and redirect these destructive subsidies towards socially responsive renewable energy and agroecological farming approaches. So this is a petition that we are widely sharing and hope to bring hundreds of thousands of signatures to the COPs this fall. And this is one of our actions as a popular movement, which is indeed a charism renewing the church in its ecological inspiration. So my last point is about radical sacramentality, which I see as a quality of divestment. people have asked if divestment is risky or ineffective or symbolic. Now, certainly the Irish can answer that in the negative with their tremendous leadership on this issue. And I will say, yes, divestment is symbolic. It's a symbol of discipleship. It's a symbol of pragmatism because of the massive scaling up of investments we need in renewable energies. And it's also a symbol of inspiration, of pledging ourselves to live according to the society we wish to have. And in a theological sense, it's a sacramental real symbol. This is a theological notion borrowed from Karl Rahner, that divestment makes truly present the gift of healthy energy to all who need it. It's akin to making bread available to the hungry by redirecting funds in the direction of the common good. So I just want to conclude with a note about this idea of essentializing, that we need not restrict ourselves to gender essentialism by lifting up the ideal of radical relationality, that affirming the diversity of all creatures in whom we are in deep solidarity is an appeal to their dignity, to their goodness, that need not rest on essential qualities, but is affirmed by their intrinsic dignity and their intrinsic worth. And that finally, Pope Francis truly affirms women, I believe, in his deep symbolic expression of our sister Mother Earth, which is a very healing passage in the very opening lines of Laudato Si, that reverses decades or centuries of some of the exploitative and patriarchal views of women. So it's a very healing and beautiful expression of women's symbolic capacity to image the earth. So I will simply close with this reference again to popular movements as our hope, especially with the young people, and the petition that we at the Global Catholic Climate Movement are sharing among all the world that we connect. And I will try to link here to the climate petition so you can see what we are sharing: healthy planet, healthy people, and a goal to bring hundreds of thousands of signatures to the UN conferences and invite leaders of all nations and all the negotiators there to recognize our demands and our call for strong action on behalf of the earth. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much to Erin for that, and for closing the circle by bringing us back to Laudato Si. And I'd like to take your concept of healthy energy, which I think is a lovely one, and one I will try and bear in mind over the coming years as someone who's worked on energy for a long, long time. And I'd like to take up that concept, which has come in, relates to one of the questions we've been asked, coming from Yvonne Orengo, and it relates to the future of our energy systems, which are changing in nature, and where the emphasis is shifting from mining the earth for coal and oil and gas to mining it for minerals and metals that will be used in our new energy systems. And Yvonne is saying that the European Union raw materials strategy in the Green Deal does include a significant increase in mining. And a lot of sites in Europe and of course elsewhere, Bolivia, Mongolia, so forth, they've been designated as sacrifice zones, and communities are being put under pressure to accept the loss of their lands and their livelihoods. And this means biodiversity loss. It's clearly got big implications for a lot of our brothers and sisters around the world. Anna, it would be very good to hear what the three of you have to say about this shift. I think I'll go to Anna first, perhaps. someone who's been involved in the Commission's work on transition. Anna? You're there? Molly, would you like to kick off on this then, please? You're muted. Yeah.
I'm sure Anna will come in and explain to us about the various regulations that the EU is setting up to control the quality of these processes. I mean, I think it's a really good point. It's like the next step in a way, because we have an economy that's been focused on a certain type of extractivism, and it's actually, you know, electric vehicles and the products of so-called clean tech do have an impact in terms of minerals extraction and mining. So, you know, it's really important that we keep a focus on that. But just to say that certainly when I was in the EU, a colleague of mine, Judith Sargentini, pushed forward a regulation which eventually the Commission did bring forward, and it was negotiated, and it was the conflict minerals regulation, which is the very first step, because that's saying we won't anywhere in the EU market use minerals that have come from a conflict zone. And obviously the focus was particularly on Congo, but there's nothing to stop us extending those rules. And I think that's what the EU, where the EU should be showing leadership as one of the world's largest and richest markets, in excluding the import of raw materials unless they meet these certain criteria. So, for example, the trade deal with Brazil should not be signed unless the mining industry in Brazil, which has caused hundreds of deaths and you know, the extermination of indigenous people and so on, unless it's regulated to a standard that we would find acceptable in our own continent, we should not import those goods. And the trade power of the EU, if it regulates its market well, is really enough to change the world. And I think we have seen that to some extent on climate, but also through the sustainable finance mechanisms, you can make certain assets stranded if you say we won't accept them in Europe. So, and then you don't accept them as like collateral in banks. And so through those, like a pincer mechanism, you can stop this dirty mining from happening. And I would just say, finally, I mean, the point of my work, I haven't really gone into my economics work very much here, but the point of it is exactly to challenge not the kind of particular mode of production that we're using at the moment, but the principles that govern a capitalist economy, namely extractivism, growth, and profit and accumulation. You know, so while we still have those principles, and that's what we think the economy should be doing, it doesn't really help if we're focusing on one, and that's why addressing climate change is really important, but addressing where the economy is structured fundamentally is also very important.
Thank you. Anna.
Yeah, I don't know, am I now acoustically on board? Yes, good. I don't know what was before because I didn't change anything, so it must have been something with the connection. And actually my answer will be short because this is an area that I have not been following at all. Having said this, part of the European Green Deal also is where a lot of action has been happening lately, is the so-called circular economy strategy. So circular economy basically requiring, it's on the core, it's an attempt, of course, to reduce also waste in various dimensions, but evidently also means that we reuse those materials. And I'm also aware that to attain, those structures that we need to make the energy transition, of course, reusing will be more and more necessary. So there are also technologies, projects, support underway to get this done. I've been very much working on the internal dimension, so within the EU of all these transitions. But also there are certain concerns, and even if you not necessarily go so far as to look on those sacrifices that you have been mentioning, Sarah, namely when it comes to the kind of feasibility. And this is the point that when it comes to, for example, the building renovations, because energy efficiency, we do have targets, we are going to raise targets. This requires investment. Let's assume that we are providing precisely to the energy poor households. There are specific programs in the recovery plans of some member states that go precisely for that, supporting households, the more in need, the better, to go for the renovations. However, this needs to be done. And we have now a situation just in my country where I'm residing now, Belgium. we have had in the past months, we are having in Belgium a renovation rate of 0.5% of the building stock per year. The Commission proposed to have renovations across Europe at 3% per year. This is to get everything done by 2050, decarbonized. So this is where the 3% comes from. But for Belgium, the aim would just be to raise it to 2% in the near term. That means to increase it sixfold. But what now we are having already in Belgium a scarcity, open vacancies in the construction sector of 20,000 people already with the 0.5. So I really don't know who is going to do the other 1.5. And on top, we are having these renovation waves simultaneously launched in all the EU countries. And we had already in the past situations where simply unskilled labor migrated to the west of Europe from the poorer EU countries. So, I mean, there are all sorts of shortages, and I mean, time will show. And of course, we need to anticipate them and plan forward. But capacity constraints are really are going to be a challenge in the whole context.
Yes, indeed. And I think this whole material side of transition is going to be something we're going to be hearing a lot more about. You will be familiar, you are of course very familiar with it already, but I think for those of us who are a little behind on all this, I think we're going to see it rise up and up in importance. Thank you. Erin, I just wonder whether you also have a take on this, this issue of materials and mining and the shift in mining.
Yes, I think it's clear that we need to develop principles, ethical principles for ethical extractivism, and yet also from the side of civil society, we have to think about the consumption side. Pope Francis warns us about a hyper-consumptive society, a throwaway society, and so the value of developing a circular economy, as Anna mentions, is so important. And I think people are not fully aware of the human and conflict cost of so many of their purchases. Pope Francis calls us to become painfully aware. Do people know there are ecological martyrs behind the mining, behind the extractivism? We need to raise this awareness so that we can empower people to support more ethical practices and better personal choices about their consumption.
Yes, and I think the role of the church in providing a channel for the voices from the majority world, from the global south, seems very important there, and we need to hear these voices more and more to know about this. I'm under strict instructions to wrap this up at 2 o'clock, and I'm afraid we're already leaking over this. It's a great pity we don't have another hour or so, and we can't answer either more of the questions that have come in. There are some very thoughtful comments and questions in the Q&A box, and I think that will probably be open for a while, so there is scope for some discussion there if you want to use that. Now I think we have to close this session. Looking forward to the final talk, the keynote lecture from Catherine Keller at 2:15. I'm saying 2:15, that's UK time. So there's time for a short break now, but in the meantime, thank you very much to all three of you, and goodbye for now.